Radio Network. It's Friday, May 18th. You may not know this. It's not a big story in the media, but there are hundreds, maybe more, of people in many countries around the world who are languishing in prisons because they were charged of attempted murder with a deadly weapon, more or less. The deadly weapon being HIV positive status and unprotected sex. Not having disclosed HIV status, having had unprotected sex, this can actually land a man in prison in many countries, including this one. It's a big problem, and it's a silent travesty of justice. Not even AIDS organizations talk about it much. And this week there was a major breakthrough, a legal victory in this realm. There was a man who was thus charged, a sergeant in the U.S. military, charged with having exposed 4 women to HIV and was facing, I'll be corrected later if I'm wrong, but I think upwards of up to 30 years in prison for this. And I don't want to give away what happened. I want our guest, who was there in the courtroom, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to tell us what happened, to unfold it for us. I want to welcome David Steele, who is an attorney based on the West Coast, based in San Francisco. He was there. He witnessed the trial. I don't know if he was counsel or what, but in any case, he was in that courtroom, and I wasn't. So I'm very interested to hear his take on it. Welcome, David Steele.
Oh, thank you, Celia, for having me. And I want to say you have a very prestigious pedigree, because I remember Barry Faber and his radio shows all those years, and I was a big fan of his as well.
Well, yeah, you just let the cat out of the bag. I have I have actually put my father on strict orders that he can't listen to me until I'm good and ready. And I didn't even want to tell him I had a radio show.
I apologize, but he's okay. Good, and so are you.
Thank you. We also have our friend and colleague, Dave Rasnick. Are you with us, Dave?
I am, Celia. It sounds like it's going to be an interesting program.
Yeah, let's with no further ado, jump right into it. David Steele, tell us what happened. Tell us first what the scene was when the trial began. What was the worst possible outcome for this defendant?
Sure. Well, the scene is it's out of that movie A Few Good Men with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise. It was on a military base at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and it's a famous Army base. It's where the 82nd Airborne is, and Delta Force, and all these big, tough, rugged guys walking around armed, and rugged gals too. I was in the Navy 25 years ago, and it's amazing to see how it's transformed. But it's very polite, tough people managing the base, and there's a big courthouse, and there was a big court-martial, and a sergeant, I'll just use his initials, TD, was being charged with essentially aggravated assault. And the basis, though, was not a gun or a knife. It was that he had consensual sex with 4 women, but did not disclose that he had been told by the Army that he was HIV positive. So he was facing 37 years in prison, and the JAG Corps defense team made a smart move and hired some defense attorneys who in turn enlisted the services of a nonprofit outfit called the Office of Medical and Scientific Justice, OMSJ, who I have worked with on some small items, and they brought me to the trial to observe. I didn't ask any questions, but I was there the whole time, and I observed it, and I can tell you all about it.
So wow, so 37 years. So they were that was specifically what the prosecution was asking for as a sentence. I mean, are military courts a little bit different than other courts?
It's a little bit different, but the basics is the same. They were charging this man with a crime, a serious crime, multiple counts.
Right. And who decided his fate exactly? Was it
there's a military judge. He's an officer, and he has a robe, and he sits there with a gavel, and he is the judge. And,
okay.
And to be honest, I mean, you don't think of Fort Bragg being the most progressive of venues, but I have to give the military credit. It was the fairest judge I've ever seen on this issue. He really was a stickler for rules and both sides, and he was open-minded. I mean, he allowed the defense to defend this guy, and the defense was that there was not good scientific evidence that he was in fact infected with HIV.
Okay, we're going to get to that in a moment.
Okay.
So he was charged by Army prosecutors.
That is right.
He was defended by who came before OMSJ? Did you say? I mean, there was two Army attorneys on the defense who also brought in two civilian attorneys. I see. Okay, who in turn OMSJ brought in its experts,
right?
And so all of those people worked together,
right?
Got it. Okay. What was first of all, was it classic, that the prosecution laid out its case and then the defense laid out its case?
Yes, I've been in court numerous times, and it was just a simple courtroom procedure where the prosecution makes its charges and says, here's what the evidence is going to be, and here's why this man should be convicted and go to prison. And the defense tries to rebut that. Okay, so they were any of the first of all, did any of the women charge him directly? The women were two of them were witnesses, so they were the ones who got in court under oath and said, I had sexual relations with TD, and he did not disclose his status to me. So they're not charging, but they're critical witnesses. Okay, had any of them turned up HIV positive themselves? No evidence of that whatsoever, and likely not, because the prosecution probably would have put that evidence on to prove that there was a transmission. So it's a safe inference that they were not positive. Well, it sounds like an awfully long time to sit in prison, 37 years, if there was no demonstrable harm. Before we get into the rest of it, so there was no woman who tested positive who could be said to have been infected, quote unquote, by this man. They testified, but that question wasn't asked. So, and it wasn't asked out of negligence. It was deemed to be irrelevant. I guess it was the theory was if you aim a gun at someone, shoot and miss, you still have committed a serious crime. But you're right. There wasn't a victim harmed. Right. Wow. Okay, now let's get to what was the essence of the defense. The essence of the defense was this: TD had a written confession admitting that he had sex with these women and knew that he had been told by the Army that he was HIV positive, but did not disclose that to the women. He did use a condom each time, and the women corroborated that. So that was a mitigating factor. But the bottom line defense is that the underlying diagnosis of being HIV positive was unreliable. And the reason it was unreliable is because the tests used, and these are tests used throughout the country. These are not unusual tests or unorthodox tests. The standard tests for claiming that that someone is infected with HIV, if you really dissect them, they don't do that. They do something that's close but not quite, and therefore there was a significant doubt whether or not TD was infected with HIV. He was totally healthy. This is a man with no symptoms. And if there was a doubt on whether he was infected with HIV, obviously he could not be convicted of risking transmitting that allegedly fatal virus to people. So that was the essence.
I have a question. This is Dave Rasnick. I understand that the sergeant was held in custody for 200 days. I guess that means in jail or something. Why so long?
That is my understanding. It was 8 months. A serious charge, a serious offense.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if there's I don't know if bail is offered or not. But I did speak with the defense attorneys, and they had said something to that effect also. So yeah, this was a very serious crime, and it was a very potentially serious consequence. And not to mention the fact that there's so much psychological stigma and emotional depression when you're told that you're HIV positive. But in fact, the defense, in my view, did a very good job of proving that was not the case. It's more likely that this guy was not infected with HIV.
Right, and another thing that was my understanding, I only know a little bit about this case, was that apparently the prosecutor was offered a plea bargain early on and turned it down, apparently thinking it was a slam dunk.
Oh, yeah.
Is that true?
It's probably true. I wasn't part of the team. I don't know, but there's no doubt that the prosecutors thought it was a slam dunk. I mean, a written confession.
Right.
A written confession, a diagnosis of HIV, and then women saying, yes, I had consensual sex with him, and they didn't tell me. I mean, the prosecution, in my opinion, thought it was a slam dunk, and they were grossly wrong because AIDS science is off. It different rules. Higher standards in traditional science exist, and AIDS seems to lower the bar on a lot of important things. And you would think that if your life is dependent on a test, the test saying you do have a fatal disease or you do not, that it would be a valid test. It would be a solid test. And it turns out the defense was able to prove that it was not.
Now, how did the defense marshal such a potent defense faced with all of this preconceived notion of a slam dunk and everything? I mean, the defense must have had some really powerful, potent arguments and evidence that the public ought to know about.
That's true. There was two witnesses, a Dr. Rodney Richards, who's a Ph.D. in chemistry, impeccable credentials. He actually worked at Amgen for many years, and he was even at Amgen when Amgen was collaborating with Abbott Laboratories on the initial HIV test in the 80s. So there's probably no man alive who knows more about the tests than him. And there was also a medical doctor named Dr. Nancy Banks, Harvard-educated, who is excellent and has studied the issue on HIV and AIDS and some of the problems with the testing and some of the problems with the toxicity of the drugs. And they both did in my opinion, a very substantial and persuasive analysis of the defects in the test and therefore the unreliability of the medical diagnosis.
So, let's jump to what the verdict was.
The verdict was not guilty, and the judge seemed to be somewhat upset with the prosecution.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, before the verdict, the judge was very hard and harsh on the prosecution. For example, the prosecution did not call anyone from the Army laboratory to talk about the methods in which this test was conducted, and so there was a gaping hole there. The prosecution did not have the treating physician of TD to talk about the diagnosis and the treatment. So there was a gaping hole there. It was almost as if the blood sample is sent out to the lab, a lab that the patient has never heard of, conducts a test, writes the results positive, sends it back to the Army, and ipso facto, that means poor TD has this terrible fatal disease. There isn't a clearinghouse, a medical treating physician, at least on this case, who is familiar with the test and is comfortable with how it's run and comfortable with its efficiency and validity, and takes ownership of an HIV positive diagnosis. So,
I'm sorry, David. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine.
So the defense and OMSJ's experts essentially zeroed in on not just this HIV test in this case, but all Western blot HIV tests. Am I right so far? And what they mean?
Yeah, I think that's fair. The Western blot test, as Dr. Richards explained, it's really not an HIV test, if you can believe it. It is a general antibody test. And so even the AIDS expert for the prosecution had to concede that none of these tests detect the virus. Now, to the layperson, I'm a layperson, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist. It seems kind of remarkable that there isn't a test to find the virus that supposedly is killing you and will kill your sexual partners. It seems to me, just on pure logic, that you ought to be able to, find this allegedly killer virus in a person who is told is HIV positive, but they can't. So what they use is an indirect method, the antibody test, which is the person's own reaction to external pathogens, and they say if you have antibodies, then we presume you have the virus. The problem, though, and this came out in testimony during cross-examination of the prosecutor's expert AIDS doctor, was that there's at least 70 different medical conditions that will cause a positive, it's called cross-reactivity, with this test. So how valid can a test be if it's going to light up for HIV plus tuberculosis plus herpes plus the flu plus vaccinations plus 65 or so other things? The defense did a very good job of undermining the reliability of this test, and it wasn't an ad hoc argument either. There is published literature, bits and pieces of it, that do a very good job of analyzing these Western blot tests and saying that they are grossly misused and unreliable.
Now,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Celia. Go ahead.
Well, I've been writing about HIV and AIDS since 1980, actually 85, 86 is when I began. 1991, I recall vividly, I hope I got the year right, there was a paper in Biotechnology when it was edited by Dr. Harvey Bialy, and it was by Eleni Papadopoulos, the Perth group. Forgive me, there were several authors on it, but she's the one that I associate with that paper. It was called Is a Positive Western Blot Proof of HIV Infection? And we devoted a whole column to it at Spin at the time when we had a monthly AIDS column, and I wrote more pieces about it. It was a landmark argument and development. And I have been honestly puzzling little by little over this ever since. It's not easy. Is a positive Western blot proof of HIV infection? Because we speak of false positives, people whose tests are, quote, wrong, right? As if there are some people whose tests are right. But isn't it true to say that no positive Western blot is what that paper called proof of HIV infection, since the test is not designed to prove HIV infection with an entity called HIV. Did I get that right?
I think so, and there's some complicated semantics in there that I'll take a crack at. It's not your fault. It's the science of AIDS has all these, I don't want to say Orwellian terms, but they're close. Everyone has heard of the phrase HIV positive, okay?
Right.
No one says I'm flu positive. No one says they are polio positive. These are all garden variety viruses that we've all heard of. No one says they're smallpox positive. So it's like this ad hoc description. And when they say HIV positive, it's misleading. It should the correct terminology should be you're positive for antibodies.
Right. Well, the HIV test has always been antibody-centric, but everybody accepted that. It's antibodies. Of course it is.
But
right?
then there's a second step. You have to say, okay, that's not the worst thing in the world. We use surrogate markers for a lot of diagnostic tests and diseases. But then the next question is, what evidence is there that presence of antibodies means that you are infected with HIV? And there isn't a lot of good science on that, if you can believe it, even after all these years.
Means that, I'm just repeating, means that you are infected with HIV. Well, how can anybody have proof of HIV infection if HIV has never been, if there's no viremia, if there's no, help me out, Dave, is there, in other words...
How does antibodies, signify the fact that you now have a current infection of anything? And of course, they can't. All they can say is that you have a reaction, but it doesn't really tell you whether or not what the reaction is to.
So there's an antibody response to something that is supposed to be an infection, but there's never really been an underpinning in all of AIDS science that there is what we call an infection. But there'd have to be what we call an infection for there to be an infection of another person.
It doesn't
That's
have
right.
to be.
There has to be an infectious agent.
It may not be an infectious agent because pregnancy is one of the conditions that triggers a positive result on these HIV antibody tests. So it's a general antibody response that could be, it could mean that you're fighting something, or it could mean you've already cleared something. It's very ambiguous, and Dr. Richards on the stand was very clear when he said a positive result from a Western blot test does not necessarily mean you're infected with HIV. And the interesting thing is, and no one does this, but if you read the package inserts for these tests, they make all these qualifications exactly what I've just said. They say, well, we presume you have antibodies, or there really isn't a standard to determine whether you have antibodies or not. I mean, the package inserts equivocate on antibodies. They don't even go to the next level that it means you have the virus there. So one of the things that came out in testimony by Dr. Banks, who's an African American woman, studied at Harvard for many years, practiced medicine in New York City, OBGYN. She said that the literature, supported by the literature, that HIV tests will light up 5 to 7 times more often for African Americans than whites. I mean, how on earth can that be, and what does that say about the test? It means it's picking up other things than HIV.
Now tell us about the mood in the courtroom. Was it as though, what did the prosecution have? What did they come back with? Did it go back and forth, or what was it like?
Well,
it was 2 days, right? Yeah,
it was a very short trial. It was very efficient. I mean, there wasn't this long speechifying. There wasn't a whole lot of back and forth. It was boom, boom, boom. I think the reason is because there's really no depositions done as in civil law, which I practice, where you spend months doing depositions of people and then you go in the courtroom. Mm-hmm. But the mood of the courtroom, it's interesting. First of all, you have, for some reason, the prosecution insisted that there be heightened security. Now, heightened security at Fort Bragg means rough young men and rough young women in green fatigues armed with weapons. Now, the funny thing is, at the first day, the judge asked the prosecution, where's the security, where's the heightened security that you asked for? And the prosecution said, well, we don't know. So that made them kind of look bad out of the box. Why there would be a need for heightened security, I have no idea. But you have armed soldiers in the courtroom. That breeds civility and calmness. So the mood of the courtroom was professional, and everything was focused on the testimony. There wasn't, and even when the verdict was read, it wasn't an outpouring of elation. It was more relief and okay, that's the decision, and let's tidy up a few things and get out of the courtroom.
Was there a big audience?
I would say there was I'd say 40 to 50 people. I'm estimating. There were certainly family members of the accused TD were there, and there certainly was a lot of Army personnel, perhaps from TD's unit or other units who were there. So there wasn't a lot, but it was I would say solemn is the word that comes to my mind of how to describe the atmosphere there.
Well, what effect do you think this decision will have on other similar cases, and also how widespread are these kind of cases?
That's a good question. I don't think they're hugely widespread, but there are. I mean, I know this for a fact because OMSJ this isn't the first time they've been called in. And in the papers, every once in a while, you'll see an article about some man and also sometimes some women who are being prosecuted for having sex without disclosing their HIV status. So it is definitely a problem. How widespread it is, I can't say. I'm guessing maybe there's 25 to 50 cases such as this in the Army each year. What can be done about it? I'm hopeful that there's going to be some changes made in the military, because my understanding is that the prosecution and the defense have to write up reports, and that goes through the chain of command in the Army, and maybe they'll rethink. They should rethink accusing these people, in my opinion, but they also should rethink the validity of these tests, because if a lot of people are being told that they have a deadly virus and that is not substantiated, I mean that's a pretty bad injustice.
David Steele, can you stay with us a little bit after our break, which is coming up in a couple minutes? I know you have to go.
Yeah, no, I have some more time.
Okay, you'll let us know when you have to jump off. But this is fascinating. What do we have? Okay, we have a couple minutes till break. It's astounding to me that you all, or the OMSJ and its experts and the defense, was able to essentially reverse a more than a quarter century deep belief system and mindset, which is that there's an AIDS virus, it's deadly, and it spreads through sex. And really at the heart of this whole situation that many of us are trying to unravel is the HIV test itself, which is what we always mean when we say it, and it's the most vulnerable part of the HIV paradigm, I would say. Would you two agree with that? The HIV test itself, with the Western blot test itself.
That's all there is to AIDS. If it weren't for a test, there would be no AIDS.
You know, the analogy that I was thinking about, I tend to agree with that, is the polygraph test, a lie detector test. And I think there's a pretty fair analogy between the HIV test and a lie detector test. I have an investigator who spent 20-plus years in the FBI and knows it backwards and forwards, and what he'll tell you is a polygraph test has utility. I mean, it is hard to beat a polygraph test. However, there's a huge degree of subjectivity. It matters who is administering the test, and there are people who can beat the test if they practice and they're trained, because obviously the test cannot detect lies, it detects stress. And the theory is if you're stressed about something, you may be lying about it. But the bottom line is, most courts in America, certainly in California, they say the polygraph is unreliable and we're not going to admit it in court to establish whether a person is telling the truth or not. The HIV test has that same unreliability. It matters who is interpreting the results, and often it's not a doctor, it's a lab tech. I mean, can you imagine your life being at the mercy of an anonymous lab technician? I'm not criticizing lab techs. Fine men and women do a good job, but I don't want them interpreting whether or not I have a fatal illness. That should be a doctor doing that. But what you find is the doctors are very, naive about these tests. They don't know much about them. They don't read the package inserts. the doctor, the AIDS expert for the prosecution, had not read the package insert for the test until the Saturday before the trial. Been practicing for 15 years.
Amazing.
So people tend to just, the test says positive, and then they move on from that to the next phase of fear and stress and worry. But very few people, even the doctors, are evaluating what does positive mean on these tests. Do they really detect HIV? Or is there a degree of subjectivity and variability that might suggest that you give it some further thought? And that's what the defense did in this case. And the judge bought it. The judge said, you can't. I mean, he said in essence, he didn't say this, but by his verdict, he said it. He said you can't put a man in jail for 37 years on an unreliable, ambiguous test.
Stay where you are. Stay where you are. We'll be right back. We got to take a short break. We'll come back with David Steele and David Rasnick. This is Radio Free Science, and we're back after the break. I'm Celia Faber. You're listening to the Progressive Radio Network. My guests are David Steele and Dr. David Rasnick. We're talking about the bombshell acquittal of an Army sergeant in Fort Bragg. This happened just days ago. He was helped by OMSJ, the Office of Medical and Scientific Justice, and its experts, as well as his own defense, and he was exonerated. He had been charged with, I keep getting the exact name of the charge wrong, but I'm going to look at my fact sheet here. So it was 4 counts of exposing 4 women to HIV. Am I right, Dave Steele, that it's assault with a deadly weapon? Is that the actual
that's
something
close.
in that arena?
That's definitely what it was. I think that the terminology was aggravated assault.
Aggravated assault.
But assault with a deadly weapon, I think it would be synonymous. I mean, that's essentially what it was.
And I'm sounding a little more. I'm sounding more laconic than I feel. I feel. And I have felt since I heard this news that this is enormous. This is very big news. This is a very big development. Because now I know OMSJ has done this kind of thing before. There are people, I don't know how many. Maybe we can get Clark Baker to call in. I'm going to give the number in a moment. Clark Baker is the founder of
Celia,
OMSJ. Yeah.
If people want to read about this, they can go to the OMSJ.org website, and they can read about this case and the other ones.
That's a good point.
That they've done. And also, I wanted to ask
Well,
Dave
let's give
Steele,
the website address. It's www.omsj.org.
Yeah. I was going to ask Dave if he knows of any other cases in the pipeline.
There are, there are. I don't want to share the names.
Right.
Some are civilian cases, just ordinary, criminal cases in various states. But I am aware of a similar criminal case coming up near the Washington D.C. area. So well, hopefully OMSJ can duplicate its results here, and if it's the same issue. It should be.
Well, this is an international human rights travesty. I did research this a couple of years ago, and I was astonished to find that actually some of what we consider to be the most liberal, advanced, civilized societies, Sweden, countries like that, I can't remember, Switzerland, have the highest rate of incarcerated HIV-accused people. This is a big problem, and these people are just dropped into prisons and never heard from again. And there has been no defense.
Yeah, it's tragic. It's definitely tragic in that sense. And there's also some counter trends too, because I mean, think about just morally and ethically, though. If a person has been told he's HIV positive, he probably should disclose that to any sexual partners. I mean, I do remember before the AIDS era, I think we lived before then, there was crimes and cases on the books where someone, for example, had herpes and didn't tell a sexual partner and gave that partner herpes. I think that's a criminal offense. That is battery. The difference with HIV, though, is that nobody knows whether the person is in fact infected with HIV, because the doctors are somewhat clueless about the tests, and the tests we can show are unreliable. So,
but, okay, I want to stop you right there. When you say unreliable, I keep getting stuck on that word because it sounds as though sometimes they work, but I don't think they ever work.
Unreliable is just maybe it's a half legal term. I mean, you have to have a reliable basis to have an expert opinion in a court of law, and
they're distortive, is what they are, right?
The terminology is we can maybe there's a better term than unreliable. I won't stick you with it. But it basically means the test doesn't do what it says or what the doctors think it does.
Okay, well, now an AIDS Orthodox person, if they were present, would say to all of us, you're such morons, because the way we really figure out that somebody's HIV infected is with PCR, right?
That's the next phase.
Viral load.
That came maybe 10 or 15 years after the first test. But if you look at the viral load, the package insert tests, it's very clear that these are not medical diagnostic tests. So even the prosecution AIDS expert, had to admit on the stand that you can't use PCR viral load tests to determine whether or not the patient is infected with HIV. Now, in practice, when the PCR test comes back with a 10 million or a 4,000, people assume that it means 10 million particles of HIV or 4,000, but they don't. The PCR HIV test probably should be renamed the nucleic acid fragmentation test or something like that. It finds a lot of DNA that may or may not derive from HIV. They're still stuck with the central problem, and that is not finding actual HIV in patients that they say have AIDS.
Yeah, it's very simple. I can state it simply. As a scientist, I'm not a lawyer. There is no test for HIV in human beings. It just doesn't exist.
Was that clear if from being in the courtroom, David, was it clear, did he seem like his eyes were glazing over with the science, or did he kind of go, aha, I get it? Did he understand the scientific arguments, did it seem to you?
There was no glazing of the eyes whatsoever, and this topic causes a lot of glaze because it's so hard to digest and understand, and there's so many emotional triggers, and then you had widespread homophobia at the inception of the disease. So it's hard to get a clear, honest look at it. And if you start from the premise that your only concern is to help patients, and it's good because it centers you. And the court, in my impression, accepted the arguments because, for one thing, there was no jury. The TD waived his right to a jury just to have the judge make the decision. So I think the judge was thoughtful and attentive and was focused on the scientific questions and saw these big holes in the prosecution's evidence.
There was a famous case revolving around a young man named Andre Perenze in Australia a few years ago, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago. Do you remember? Anybody remember?
I remember that case. I wasn't involved with it, but I remember it.
Right. And how that was, well, I'll just sum it up briefly for our listeners. He was accused of, in that case, I believe they did have a couple of ex-girlfriends who claimed they had that they had seroconverted, but I can't be sure of that. But what I do remember is it was enormous. And Andre Perenze was convicted, and at that point, experts from the other side of the scientific fence were brought in to try to, to unravel this, like was as OMSJ just did down at Fort Bragg, and major AIDS experts were flown in, and major dissenting critics were flown in. And it went nowhere, and it just fell apart. Nobody was convinced of anything, and he's out of prison now. But it seemed at the time like there would just be no way to shatter the validity of the HIV test in a court. And a lot of people were very depressed and very angry about it. And if I'm not overstating, that is what has just happened. The validity of the HIV test has been shattered in a U.S. military court.
Yeah, I mean you're the professional wordsmith and you master of language. I hope it's been shattered. It certainly was shattered in this case. I don't know what the
the validity was shattered in a court in this case.
That is true.
So if this can be a precedence,
that's right.
Then we've got something. And we have a lot of people who deserve to walk out of prison fast.
Even more than shattering, the paradigm or the narrative. I mean, I've taken at least 2 HIV tests that I can remember in my life. One in the military and one for insurance, maybe recently, like when I was an adult. When I was in the military, I was a teenager. And just the fear and anxiety and depression that is attendant with this test is phenomenal because basically, either you have a fatal illness or you don't. But no one really, grasps whether the test is valid or not. And my thought is, I remember the anxiety of waiting for the results, and my heart goes out to people who have been diagnosed HIV positive, and whether they know that there may be a chance you're not, or that the basis for that diagnosis may be weak. And that would be my primary concern is just to let people know. It's documented in the literature at least 70 false positives. So, I mean, that's public information, public knowledge, and that means necessarily that this test is roping many more people into its kind of net than deserve to be there. That's all. It's not, I don't have to go into the overarching arguments of Dr. Peter Duesberg, the complexities of it. It's just, does this person have HIV or not based on this test? And the consequences are dire, so the test really ought to get it right, even on mainstream terms.
So they didn't come back and say, well, we did PCR, we did viral load, we have all these other ways of saying that, yes, he was HIV positive. They didn't do that?
No, they didn't. Their AIDS expert was basically saying, I'm a smart guy, I'm a nice guy, I'm an articulate guy, I'm an AIDS doctor, trust me. And that's how they operate. They don't, I mean, let me just give you another analogy. I mean, I'll move from my polygraph to cancer, which is analogous to AIDS. If you come into the doctor with a bad cough and you're having trouble breathing, they may take an X-ray of you and they may see cloudiness in your lungs, and they may say you've had a pleural effusion, which is a fancy word for liquid in the lungs. That's not good. You don't want liquid in your lungs. It doesn't mean you have cancer, though. It means we got to further investigate. So they may do a biopsy and send some of your tissue in your lungs to a pathologist. And he has a powerful microscope, and he'll look at the tissue, and he'll say, I'm looking at your cells, and I have bad news. These are cancer cells. Now, I'm also going to do some immunohistochemical staining, which is antibody tests, to confirm it, because maybe they're not cancer cells, but this will be the confirmation. So you go through these layers to determine whether or not the patient has cancer. And with HIV and AIDS, you don't do any of that. You do antibody test and viral load, and you have a fatal illness. And that's, I mean, it's shocking if people and doctors were really to appreciate that fact.
Now, if we do have a trend in the future of people being exonerated, let out of prison, these kinds of convictions being overturned, this test being increasingly questioned, who's responsible for this disaster, would you say? The test manufacturers, they have their disclaimers in place in the product insert, right?
Yeah.
The doctors, in turn, who perform the tests, they've been told by By who? In other words, where does the buck stop?
It's a great question, and when you have a massive systemic failure, for example, with the banking crisis. I mean, who do we blame for the banking crisis? Everyone can point the finger at someone else, and everyone can avoid blame. We could all just sit there and blame George Bush. That's easy, but that doesn't get to the root of the problem. And what does George Bush care anymore? He's retired and rich on a ranch in Texas. So it's hard to point the finger at one or two people. But when you have a systemic failure, you can kind of assess it and take a look at it and try to correct it. There's a couple people, scientists in the government, who I think ought to know better and ought to have done something about this and have probably contributed to the problem. And I would name Anthony Fauci as a problem person in this whole thing. He should be reassessing the whole so-called epidemic and the validity of these tests. But there's so much money at stake and so much prestige. I mean, AIDS I think it started out fairly noble, people trying to figure out why these predominantly young gay men were dying, and that's what science should do. But then it just careened into this craziness of funding and these empty gestures of wearing red ribbon and walking around and pretending you're doing something. I mean, what does a red ribbon mean? You have sympathy? Yeah, I have sympathy too, but I don't walk around with a red ribbon. I'd rather find the problem and solve it. And so it's a billion-dollar industry, and you have the pharmaceutical companies who have a lot of drugs to sell, and the test is a gateway to all that. So there's a lot of power and inertia that doesn't want you to reevaluate these tests. They actually want more AIDS patients because that's customers to them.
When you really think it all the way through, every single person who's received an HIV positive test is vulnerable to this if they don't have it in writing.
Yeah.
Anybody can say, well, he didn't tell me or she didn't tell me. Anybody, it's a terrifying situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's bad enough that you have to deal with the stigma of the disease, and then take it one step forward. You might become a criminal. You have a choice. You can either become asexual for the rest of your life or a criminal. I mean, with so much at stake. All I can say is, if I ever tested positive for HIV, I would dig. I would dig into it. I would go on the internet. I would look at these tests. I would talk to some experts who disagreed with it. I would really try to assess it. And sadly, a lot of people just don't do that. They just kind of accept them at face value and try to plow forward. And I have a lot of sympathy for them. I mean, most patients really do rely on their doctors, and it's almost like patients have to take their own health care into their own hands and start researching it and taking charge of it. And it's a tough task.
I asked Clark Baker of OMSJ for some comment. He emailed me. I just want to read this as just so we really, imagine this before we part today. Had OMSJ and its experts and the defense not stepped in, this would have been the fate of TD. And I'm reading from what Clark Baker sent me. Had TD been convicted, prison officials would have forced him to take ARVs, which would have eventually killed him. He would have worn HIV sexual predator prison garb, which further isolates inmates like him. He probably would have died within 10 years. His freedom and departure from the Army, busted to private and bad conduct discharge, will return him to his home, where he will likely find a lot of employment as a computer technician. He goes on, I'll wrap up here, after more than 30 years, this is the good news, we've finally found a way to expose the widespread corruption and incompetence that permeates the medical and scientific elements of the HIV/AIDS industry. This and future cases expose virology as the pseudoscience that it is. That's Clark Baker of OMSJ, www.omsj.org. I have said of OMSJ that I expect OMSJ to become the Amnesty International of medical and scientific injustice. and human rights violations, which I think is, in most Western nations, I think people are more vulnerable now to medical and scientific human rights violations than any other form. It's become, and it's creeping up on us, and there are more and more people who are realizing how many embedded, hidden dangers there are in the system that can just destroy a person's life in a finger snap.
And it's getting worse.
Yeah, the only, the first line of defense has to be the individual person to not be guided by fear and anxiety, and to take charge of their own health and their own medicine. The doctor works for the patient. I don't know when that relationship got reversed, but when I have clients can fire me with a snap of a finger if they don't like what the lawyer's doing. I don't run the show; the client runs the show. And it's the same thing with doctors. I mean, if I were tested positive HIV, I would spend an hour grilling the doctor. Why do you think I have this deadly virus? Tell me what you know about it, and cite for me the papers in the literature that you rely on so I can read those, and tell me if you've ever thought about it from a different perspective. I mean, I really would go in there and try to figure it out. If my life was at stake, I would not be shy about whether it truly was. And that's the thing about AIDS and HIV. I mean, there's so many patients who have no symptoms, none. So it's kind of inverted traditional.
Oh, I forgot to ask. Did this gentleman have symptoms?
None. He's a healthy Army guy.
Do we know when he first tested positive?
At least a year before. But again, it's the most bizarre disease that you can walk around with a fatal illness and have no symptoms.
Yeah.
And so if you have no symptoms, consistent with that is that you don't really have the virus.
Well, what I've said about that is therefore it is parallel to the disease in our monetary system, in that it is the world's first debt-based disease. You're in debt to your symptoms in the future, even before you get them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah,
and fear is the currency of the debt. We only have about 1 minute. David Steele, did you speak to him, to the defendant? Did you get a sense of how he felt when it was over?
Oh yeah, he was obviously relieved, and he was grateful, and it was a crushing
got his
burden.
life back. Huh?
Yeah, and it's not like a moment in TV where the music starts playing and everything is happy. It's kind of a realization that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not going to be that bad. So my impression was that he was grateful, and his family was very courteous and friendly and supportive. And we wish him the best, and it'd be great to have him back in 10 years being totally healthy.
Yeah.
And again, there is a possibility that he is infected with HIV. There is a possibility that HIV will cause damage and injure him. But let's not jump to conclusions so quick and so early based on such a flimsy test.
Well, there's many reasons to be hopeful for the future, and I am, and we are, and we're very grateful to you, to OMSJ, to all you great people, and we'll be back next Friday, 3:00. This is Radio Free Science. I'm Celia Faber. You're listening to Progressive Radio Network.